So hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ramona Della Pozza and I'm a knowledge broker for the National Environmental Science Program Climate Systems Hub. I work for the University of Tasmania, which is one of the partners of the hub. And I'm fortunate to have a team of state and territory knowledge brokers also working with me. Today I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar on emissions reduction in the boom and bust of Australia's carbon budget, the challenge and opportunity. We're very lucky today to have two experts to speak to us, Dr. Pep Cannadell and Dr. Dan Rosauer. So thanks very much for joining us today, Dan and Pep. We're very lucky to have you. And first of all, I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. I'm currently on Wurundjeri country and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend that acknowledgement to the lands that you're all on today. And I extend respect to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be present at today's webinar as well. So some of you may not have heard about the NESP, National Environmental Science Program. So a little bit of background. The Climate Systems Hub is one of 4 multidisciplinary hubs within the Australian Government's NESP program, so National Environmental Science Program. The Climate Systems Hub is an applied science program with our goal is really that our research directly informs decisions, policies and climate adaptation responses, and it is advancing the knowledge of future climate in Australia. We're very lucky in the hub, as I said, to have a network of knowledge brokers across states and territories to strengthen the impact of the hub by shaping the climate science research to really build a picture of national end user requirements. The format of today's webinar, just to let you know, it will be recorded. Pep and Dan will talk for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have questions at the end for both of them that I'll facilitate. During the presentations, we'd encourage you to put your questions in the chat. So there's a Q&A function here. And so please put your questions in and give it a thumbs up, I think, in the voting function so that we can prioritise how we answer the questions. We will endeavour to get to all the questions, but we may run out of time. So we'll answer them afterwards if we can, if we run out of time. So without any more delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Pep Cannadell, our first speaker. And Pep is a Chief Scientist in CSIRO and Executive Director of the Global Carbon Project. He is a project leader of the Transition to Net Zero project in the NESP Climate Systems Hub. And Pep's work focuses on highly integrative and interdisciplinary research on global and regional analyses of trends, drivers and budgets of the sources and sinks of the main greenhouse gases. More recently, he's focused on abrupt ecosystem changes and collapse due to rapid climate change, including the role of fire. Pep has been a contributor to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, for the last 15 years, and also contributed to assessments to the World Meteorological Organisations. I will now hand over to Pep to explain Australia's carbon budget. Thank you, Pep.
Thank you, Ramona, and thank you everyone for your interest. I'm going to begin with 3 pieces of context for the work we do. The first one is that 30% of all CO2 emissions coming from anthropogenic activities, combustion of fossil fuels, land use change, deforestation, are being removed by what we call the natural CO2 sinks. The next one is, if we're just looking at the 43 emission reduction target by Australia by 2030, we're now at 28% emission reductions on our way to the 43. And the figure shows that the the land use change component, that is the biospheric component of the entire budget of at least the National Greenhouse Inventory, is due to mostly land use change. So we've done great progress with emission reductions with electricity, as you can see there, but this thing has been mostly being offset by increases in other parts of the economic sectors like fugitive emissions, transport, and stationary. And land use change remains this fundamental large component of these emissions trends, which just underscores the importance for us to really understand well the biospheric sources and sinks, how they evolve, how we can utilize them to increase our carbon sinks. The third piece of context is this emissions at net zero targets. We have net zero targets legislated in Australia for 2050. And notice, as you know, the net in front of zero, meaning that there's no expectation, or we don't think that it's possible to actually have zero emissions by 2050, but there's going to be plenty of remaining emissions, which will need to be offset with an equivalent amount of carbon being removed from the atmosphere. So it can be machines that suck up the CO2. It can be most likely the intervention of, again, landscape level management to increase carbon sinks, or if we go the route of bioenergy. This is a preliminary assessment, which of course is going to change every year from now on into the future. That was done, and it showed that Australia, could have as much as 30% emissions left by 2050, showing how much of removal will need to be done. And again, back to underscoring the relevance of the landscape sinks. So with this thing in mind, the NESP and the Global Carbon Project, which is a global consortium of scientists, which I'm the director of it, we developed this regional carbon cycle assessment, which was an effort to bring the global carbon budget, which is very well constrained, to regions all the way down to, if possible, to nations, which is what we're presenting today. So the goal was to come with every single piece of scientific equipment measurement data we have to develop a bottom-up full carbon source sinks, anthropogenic and natural. Basically, it's a net balance from the bottom up, utilizing and building from the National Greenhouse Inventory, which is a very advanced, within Australia, a very advanced greenhouse inventory for all the anthropogenic sources and sinks, and then a number of land surface modeling, global downscaling products and modeling to fulfill all the data that we didn't have necessarily in-house for the Australian budget. And I will not pretend that we have all these data. We made an effort to bring whatever data we could with a clear understanding of the uncertainties of these data to be able to close the budget, but really showing that there's a lot of things that we don't know. The other one was to take full advantage of atmospheric constraints. We've been unlocking this country where we have not been able to use much of the available atmospheric constraints to look at the net carbon balance from the air, from the atmosphere. But now with the advent of remote sensing satellites, which they do measure column CO2 and methane, we are now in a position to begin to explore that data and to see what it's telling us about the overall budget. And then, of course, an effort to understand how these things match with each other. So this is actually the full budget. And I could stop here saying, this is the talk I wanted to give, just to show that there is a full research paper with all the details. I will not kind of start my discussion here, but go into a simplifying infographic and leave for any details you want for you to look at the actual research paper and the questions and answers time. So we have three elements of this budget: the anthropogenic CO2 fluxes, which are very clear, of course, all the combustion of fossil fuels dominated by coal, oil, and gas, We have some cement. We do things to the soils in agriculture. We have a small one. Remember that this is only CO2 carbon. So here there's no methane, there's no nitrous oxide, which are very important greenhouse gases. These are greenhouse gases we are working on right now. And then we have logging, crops, everything we do with livestock and the land use change. Notice that the land use change is not a net source to the atmosphere, according to the National Greenhouse Inventory, but is actually a small, reasonable sink. That it means that we are regenerating vegetation or reforesting, forests more than we are doing land clearing. The next group is the mixed CO2 fluxes. That is, fluxes that are mixed between anthropogenic and natural, that the partition is not clear how to do it. And of course, nowadays, so much of anything that's happening in nature is influenced directly or indirectly by, other human activities. So we have bushfires and regrowth. This is what's called a net flux. It is actually a reasonably modest flux for what you would have thought about, having a huge flux, particularly coming from the Black Summer fires. And just to kind of put in perspective, and I'll explain this thing a little more, these 36 million tons of carbon average over the last decade. It's again, this balance between regrowth and emissions. And it kind of captures all the, regrowth of all the fires that have been happening in the previous years, which of course are regrowing also, during the decade that we studied. Some of the gross flux emissions for fires, just to put this thing in perspective, of what happened in the Black Summer was that at least 400, million tons of CO2, that's equivalent of this red summation of all the anthropogenic fluxes, as much as double of that, more than 800 million tons of CO2 coming from CO2 emissions from the fires that happened that particular year. And I'll explain why this humongous flux is not shown here. As I said, we are averaging the whole decade, and we're bringing all the regrowth that is happening and has been happening because the previous fires in other areas. And then we have rivers and lakes, which is a very significant flux. It's a very difficult flux to report and very difficult to actually partition between anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic. And then we have coastal ecosystems, the mangroves, the seagrass meadows, that are, to the extent we have data for it, we know that are important stocks. And as I said, repeat, to the extent we have flux measurement data, mostly brought from other parts of the world, it seems to be a significant sink into the system. Finally, we have what we call the natural CO2 fluxes. These are very difficult fluxes to measure. And these particular fluxes that I'm showing with large uncertainties are modeled based on first principles and the global budget, which I'll explain very quickly. Then there's geological weathering, that is CO2 and water interacting with rocks and forming more rocks. That's a geological thing that has always happened on the Earth. And then we have the oceans, and specifically our continental shelves, around 200 miles around Australia, where there also are a significant sink. Oceans are sinks. The more CO2 we put into the atmosphere, the more CO2 is going to go into the ocean. And our coastal regions, continental shelves, are indeed, to our best of ability, knowledge, is also a sink. There are places individually that can be sources if there's a lot of import of organic matter from, or particularly matter from the land, but as a whole, they're consistent with what then we see in the open ocean as well. Now, at this point, we could begin to do net carbon balances with all these arrows in and out of Australia. And so one way will be to take everything and just say, all right, what's the net balance? So 140, which indicating that a lot of the natural sinks and others are compensating some of our fossil fuel to a large extent, these fossil fuels. I'll say very quickly here is that the Paris Agreement, it actually calls for reaching net zero emissions, kind of balancing out the emissions by sources from the removals. And it really refers to the anthropogenic. not to the natural components of it, to the extent we can differentiate these natural components. And the reason is that the natural components are already built in our analysis to say that by 2050, the whole world moves in 2050, following certain pathways of decarbonization, we can reach a certain stabilization level of warming by certain time. So just repeat that the net zero emissions really focus on the anthropogenic components, and as I said, to our best ability to distinguish it from those natural ecosystems, which are already counted elsewhere. And then we have, in terms of accounting, overall accounting, of course, we have a lot of carbon which is embedded into the exports of the fossil fuels, mostly coal and gas that we export, overseas. Now, from an accounting point of view, within the umbrella of the Convention of Climate Change, which of course, we can do this accounting in whatever way we want, but based on what the Convention has established, these emissions, the emissions from these exported, carbon embedded, will be counted on those countries which are use, combust, and decompose, those products, and the emissions reach the atmosphere in their own country. So I said that we have this big land natural CO2 sink, which is very uncertain, it's modeled, and where it comes from is from the global carbon budget, where we have to have, as I said at the very beginning of this talk, 30% of the total emissions being removed because they're not in the ocean, they're not going into the ocean, and they're not staying in the atmosphere. Now, that's what we call the missing sink decades ago, which now we model, and we know that it's on land. And one of the key processes is what we call the CO2 fertilization effect, which basically means plants grow better with CO2, and they remove more CO2. And what you see here is a modeled CO2 fertilization effect on the natural sinks, which of course places where there is a lot of forests, like in the Amazon, in the Congo, you see the most benefit of this CO2 fertilization effect, and you see less, but still all across Australia, in places where, as I said, as Australia, there is less biomass than these big places. The other comment I want to make is that fire emission component, which it's almost surprising that it was not bigger than less than 40 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere annual average over the last decade. And I was saying that's the net regrowth and emissions average over many years, which basically means that, we're having lots of forests in many different parts of the country, regrowing after fires in different times of the past. This is just to illustrate this thing. It's just an example. It was a very preliminary study we did very quickly right after the Black Summer. And what you see is a biomass product, which is a remote sensing. It's a satellite-based product, very coarse, but it suggests that within a year of the Black Summer fires, we had many regions around the southeast, which the biomass was almost recovered to the state it was prior to the fire. Of course, prior to the fire, we just came from 2 years of drought, and there was a lot of biomass that had gone by then. But nevertheless, it shows that we do, if we have favorable conditions, as we have over the last 4 years, and illustrating these pictures on the right, you do have all the standing carbon in trees that may have dead stems. These stems can be there for a decade or more, which means the carbon is not gone, is not in the atmosphere. At the same time, the canopy is being recovered from the bottom, in the case of the top picture, or all across the stems through the regrowth, which of course, all these things will be reorganized over the coming decade or two. But from a carbon perspective, you can see the possibility that, this fast recovery and return of the CO2 back to the vegetation, is possible in Australia, where fires, of course, are part of the system. At the same time, I should point out the fact that, of course, fire regimes are changing. And if we look at just forest fires, where the most carbon is per hectare, we see the rise of, no doubt about, mega fires of more than 1 million hectares of burn area per season in the last 20 years. And if we look at the right side of the figure, we see now fire return intervals, the frequency of fire coming back to the same place at intervals of less than 20, 15 years, which for some forests, which do not regrow, like the alpine forest or the mountain forest, mountain ash and alpine ash in the Victorian Alps, we actually were beginning to have conditions that could potentially in the future prevent from these forests to recover and therefore to leave a big chunk of the biomass and the carbon, into the atmosphere as opposed to bringing it back. So just one word about this component of what we call the land-ocean aquatic continuum, which often it's hard to measure and certainly is a big mix of anthropogenic versus natural components. Rivers always bring lots of dissolved organic matter, particular organic matter as part of the runoff after big rains. But of course, we have altered our landscapes, big deal. We have open up for agriculture, soils get exposed to runoff, and we have increased big deal the erosion. To what extent this thing, of course, is directly anthropogenic versus non, but the fluxes are not small, and they have big uncertainties, particularly on the rivers. And then we have other components which contribute to a smaller extent. And the last one that I want to just kind of highlight, we have very little data on the actual fluxes of coastal ecosystems, seagrasses, meadows, salt marshes, and mangroves. Truth of the matter is that from a flux point of view, we do not have, flux measurements. But of course, we have stock measurements. We know that sediments contain a lot of carbon. They have been accumulated over hundreds or thousands of years. There's issues of to what extent the land component is contributing to those sediments by runoff. It's a complex system, but nevertheless, it's a system that, it's important to look at carefully because it's real capacity to continue absorbing carbon dioxide into the future, and perhaps not just only protecting it, but also enhancing it. The last slide I'm going to show is when we kind of moved into looking at the whole story from the satellites. So here what I show is information from 2 satellites split by year. So we had the decade that I show you, mean averages all the time. Now I'm going to show you year to year. And the first thing that you kind of realize is that if we were to take, a mean value, make it 0 over the last 10 years, we see that the whole continent goes from being a huge sink on the left, 2010-11, to a massive source, in 2018-19, again, back to neutral, back to small source, back to neutral, and back to a big sink. Just one year to another, like switching on and off an incredible fast rate of these emissions. And if we were to look at, the rainfall anomaly, you would not be surprised, of course, that a big deal of this switching from one to another, is really driven by the anomaly of the rainfall itself. And just to put things in perspective, how important these things, if you look at 2010-11, of course, it was a big La Nina. We had huge amounts of rain. We created a monster carbon sink. And just to say that, I'm not saying this monster just freely, this would be comparable to the kind of additional sink we could see coming from the Amazon without the deforestation component. So it's a very significant sink globally when we have these massive, swings. 2010-11 was particularly, exceptional, and we'll see what happens, of course, with the last 3 years of La Nina. Anyway, I'll stop here and pick it up later on with the questions and answers. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Pep, for that very clear and comprehensive explanation of a very complex system. So thank you for that. Please keep adding your questions in the Q&A function. I see there's one there, so that Pep can answer later on. So now we will go to Dan. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Dan Rosawa. So thanks for joining us today, Dan. Dan is an ecologist with a background in greenhouse accounting, biodiversity, and spatial modelling and environmental policy. As part of CSIRO's towards net zero mission, he models vegetation processes to improve the estimation of greenhouse gas emissions and sinks in Australia's living environment. So I'll now hand over to Dan to tell us about the mapping of Australia's vegetation and the future opportunities for Australia's carbon sink. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ramona. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're meeting on. In my case, it's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra. So PEP's given us this really big picture view of the carbon fluxes coming in and out of Australia, and also just that amazing variability between seasons and between years. What I'd like to do is actually focus on a much smaller part of that, which is just the anthropogenic component, and particularly in terms of vegetation. And that's the anthropogenic component, which is what we then report. Australia reports to the Climate Change Convention every year. So now I just tried to advance the slides, and can I grab control of that? Good, thank you. So the graph on the left you're probably quite familiar with, or something similar. This one actually comes from Australia's emissions projections that DQ published late last year, and what it shows, the bold black line, Australia's trend in emissions declining since about 2007, and you can see that to the left of that now line we're looking at observed reported emissions, and to the right it's projections based on assumptions about the economy, technology, government policies. And you can see that emissions are projected to continue to decline. Now, if you look at the individual sectors, what you see is that decline is actually only coming really significantly from two sectors. Right down the bottom in the sort of the black cross hatching is electricity, and that's going down as we transition to renewable electricity generation. And then we've got the land sector, which is labelled here as LULUCF, land use change and forestry. And this is the effects largely, as in the way that PEP defined them, of the anthropogenic component of land management. And what we see is that was actually a significant component of Australia's emissions back in 1990, as much as 31% in fact. Now that's declined, and since 2015, Australia's been a net carbon sink, reporting up to most recently 63 megatons of sink in the last year. So it counteracts a significant component of the anthropogenic emissions coming from other sectors. If you look at the graph in the top right, you can see that in terms of the target we're trying to reach, a 43% below 2005 by 2030, that red dotted line suggests that on current approaches, we're going to hit about 37% below. With new measures that have been announced but maybe not implemented yet, we're projected to nearly get there, down to about 42%. So that's for the year 2030. Looking further into the future though, and I think the control didn't seem to be working for me. There we go. Looking further into the future, all I've done here is just thrown a straight line on, going from where we are now down to zero in 2050. What this tells you is that the challenge for all these different sectors that haven't been reducing much yet, it's going to be a very significant challenge to get down to net zero. And for some sectors such as agriculture, just by the very nature of the soil metabolism, they're not going to net zero as long as we're cultivating and growing food. So this is where the opportunity from the land sector comes in, and the opportunity to increase through our policies and decisions and incentives to actually increase that land sector sink. So what I want to look at now is just a little bit more on why we have this opportunity, and the fact that we have an opportunity now to increase the land sink, which in effect means to have more trees, bigger trees, and more soil carbon is because historically, going back to the start of European settlement, we've reduced that carbon greatly. And of course, that's all the clearing that's gone on since European settlement. Looking at the map on the right, the cream areas where we've cleared largely for agriculture, and also in the green areas that are showing as forest and woodland. Those areas have been thinned a lot for grazing, or the biomass has been reduced by timber harvesting. So it's actually these things that we've done in the past that actually that's why we have an opportunity now for a carbon sink looking into the future. And in the graph on the left, what we see that pink line is Australia's net rate of land clearing. And again, going back to 1990, it was very high, up over 600,000 hectares per year. Now that has declined, and most of the years since 2007, the area of Australia covered by forests has actually been growing. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems or hotspots of clearing or issues with habitat loss and biodiversity, but overall there is also a good news story that Australia's forest area is increasing. And the other thing that's important to note here, if we look at the part of that graph that's pointing upwards, the green and the black lines, what you can see is, again, going back to 1990, most of the clearing was the green, which is primary forest conversion, whereas now nearly all of the clearing that's going on is secondary forest, typically younger trees that have regrown on agricultural lands and are being cleared to maintain grazing. Now, what that means is that per unit of area cleared, the amount of carbon released, the amount of biomass is a lot less. So the emissions from Australia's land conversion have greatly declined. The other thing about biosequestration, when we look at the opportunity that we have actually to put trees, to put carbon back into the landscape, that opportunity comes from the history, and we've got the ability to put carbon back in a number of ways that you'd be familiar with, whether that's permanently adding trees to the landscape, simply planting out paddocks, or perhaps shelter belts, things like that. Plantations, where even though harvesting continues and you're producing a timber resource, the overall amount of timber and carbon in that area is far greater than it would have been under pasture, for example. We've got natural regeneration. We simply take off the grazing and let the trees grow back. Change fire regimes, moving closer to traditional Indigenous burning practices where you can reduce the severity of fires and increase the amount of living biomass, the amount of trees that build up in those landscapes. And of course, we want to do this in ways that integrate carbon and biodiversity benefits. But there's a really important point to make about this, and that is that it's not a forever process. What we're doing, and if you look at the graph on the right, or the sketch on the right, and this applies, so that graph on the right is showing carbon stock on the land. So it's the carbon that's in the trees, in the soil carbon. And this applies whether you're talking about a single paddock or a whole continent, that what you can see is the carbon declining, from the past, it was declining for quite some time. We're now at the present where it's just starting to increase. And we can imagine through policies that put trees back into landscapes, improve soil carbon, we're going to have a significant amount of sequestration going on. And also in areas where cessation of timber harvesting, for example, in some states, leads to a lot of regrowth that can happen in those areas. There's going to be carbon sequestration, but it's not forever. What we're doing is moving from a lower level of carbon stock to a higher carbon state. And when we get to that higher carbon state, when our paddock is full of mature trees or something analogous across significant areas of Australia, we've done that. We've increased our carbon stock, and then our sink declines because we're not further adding carbon to what those areas can sustain. We've then got the task ongoing into the future of maintaining those areas with their higher carbon stock, their carbon-rich soils, their mature trees. So it's really important to distinguish this process when we're talking about carbon in landscapes from, for example, other technology changes such as moving to sustainable electricity or decarbonising other parts of our economy, where once you've made that technological change, it's the benefit that it makes to our overall carbon accounts. You can expect that benefit to be ongoing into the future as long as you continue to use that technology. Biosequestration, when we're talking about the living environment, is different to that, and it is this one-off change, this one-off opportunity, and that's important to remember when we think about where our carbon balance might be further into the future. So the Climate Change Authority asked CSIRO to investigate Australia's carbon sequestration potential, and a report was prepared in 2022. And one of the things that they did was looked at a whole range of different technologies with potential for carbon sequestration in Australia. And in each case, you can see that triangle there. They started first looking at, as broad as possible, at how much sequestration was technically or biophysically possible. They then looked at the subset of that might actually be economically feasible. And then within that, there's a smaller component which was seen as actually realizable given a range of other constraints. And then there's that small bit that's in there, the black rat down the bottom, we're talking about what's actually currently being delivered. And another element that they weren't able to explicitly model is actually competition between different land and resource uses, for example, whether that's land, water, energy that might be required for carbon sequestration. So there's a lot on this slide, but what you've got on the left is a list of the different technologies that were evaluated. From up the top, you've got a range of essentially tree growing methods. Down the bottom, you've got some of the more industrial approaches such as direct air capture or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, pyrolysis biochar, where you actually heat the biological material, where it's wood or other biostock, and heat that in the absence of oxygen and produce stable carbon that can then be stored, perhaps buried. So they evaluated all these different technologies, and what you can see looking at the right is how much they cost, from the very cheap $5 a tonne up to some others that have far higher or more uncertain price tags, how long the storage would last, whether that's from decades up to millions of years, the actual sequestration that's going on at the moment, and then the estimated potential sequestration in 2050 from these different methods. Now, when you break down all these different approaches, they largely break down into two categories. The top category, essentially the methods dealing with vegetation and soil, are happening now. They're relatively low cost. We know how to do them. So that's kind of the present, what's already going on. They tend to offer fairly short-term storage and could be potentially reversible if land management changes. Down the bottom, we've got a whole lot of other methods where there's active research going on, and the Toward Net Zero mission is quite involved in this, whether that's for direct air capture or other forms of storage or mineral carbonation, enhanced weathering. A lot of potential, really valuable research topics, but generally not at the stage now where these things can actually be rolled out. They're hopes for the future. So looking at these vegetation methods, which is essentially what we can move on the most at, right now, the sequestration report estimated an opportunity to deliver between 90 and 114 megatons of sequestration per year by 2050. Now, considering that our current land carbon sink in Australia's reported greenhouse accounts is about 64 megatons per year, we're talking a quite substantial increase on top of that, if that was able to be achieved. And they do say in the report that's based on opportunistic assumptions on uptake, on competition, and on scaling. You can't simply, for example, roll these things out without considering all the other land uses, farming and communities, and as well as scaling in terms of things like the workforce that's needed, the seed stocks that are needed to be able to actually go out, for example, if one was going to do large-scale planting. And the other thing which mirrors the graph that I showed you just a slide or two ago is that most nature-based solutions saturate. The storage rates will eventually slow and stop as forests grow to maturity, and similarly for soils, and that these annual sequestration figures will last for 15 to 40 years or so and then cease. I think that probably there's going to be a lot of variability in the timeframes that the different aspects of sequestration cease, but again, we're talking about a wonderful and important opportunity, but not one that's going to be part of the very long-term carbon sink for Australia, at least not simply based on these land use changes. So just one other thing to consider, of course, is that these efforts to revegetate and to put more carbon into our landscapes are, of course, happening in the very context of a changing climate. So both average and extreme climates are changing. And this means that for most species, their geographic range, their rate of growth, and maximum biomass potential are all going to change. And there's also the effect of changed fire and flood regimes. On the left is some figures from a study we did a few years ago, looking at about 700 of Australia's eucalyptus species and how their geographic ranges, well, actually, I should be more careful, how the climate in which they currently are found is predicted to shift going through, in this case, to 2085. And what you can see is the climates that most species are found in will be shifting. The majority, over 500 or 580 species, that the area of that climate envelope is going to shrink. In a few cases, it's going to expand, and in some cases, there'll be no examples of the climate those species currently occur in found in the future under the climate scenario that we used. And here's an example of one of the species where its area of suitable climate is predicted to increase. Eucalyptus blakeleyi, Blakely's red gum, predicted to expand right through Western Queensland and into the Northern Territory across that rangeland belt. This doesn't mean that species are going to shift in that way. It just means that if they're going to continue to exist in the climate they currently are found in, that would occur. So this is a significant impact. And another one, of course, as Pet mentioned, is CO2 fertilisation. Now, we understand CO2 fertilisation very well at the laboratory or greenhouse level in terms of the metabolic changes, increases in growth. And as Pep explained, we understand it also pretty well at that global, very broad scale where we know that carbon is being absorbed into a range of different environments. Where we need to work, and a challenge for researchers in a group such as the one I'm in, is that we don't have a good understanding of how that actually plays out across natural landscapes across Australia, how much extra carbon we should expect to be absorbed into particular tree species or particular areas, how much their maximum biomass potential would actually change. So what this means, if we're coming back to that graph where our carbon sequestration, our land carbon stock maxes out at some point, is that we don't exactly know what that point is going to be. Is it going to be? Is it going to be higher with dominated by the effects of increased CO2 fertilisation, or lower as effects of fire and drought impact potential biomass? So this is an area where we're actually doing research, and we'll be hoping to run models looking at a range of different ways of incorporating CO2 fertilisation into our vegetation models at national and more local scales. So that's everything I had, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that excellent presentation as well. Really very interesting and really insightful. We now have some time for questions. So we've already got some in the Q&A function. It'd be great if you could add some more, but I think we can get started, and you can give it a thumbs up as well if you want to, but we'll just start with the first one from Sonia Bloom. This was a question for you, Pep, where she's saying that the CO2 fluxes from rivers and lakes were surprisingly large to her. So could you explain how rivers and lakes act as sources of CO2, please?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And so basically, the land moves a lot of carbon into this aquatic system of river, lakes, and everything else. If you go to the Amazon, that freshwater component is actually huge. And you can think about rain just kind of and all the runoff, pushing organic matter, litter, soil particles, all into the rivers. And then in the rivers, two things happen. One, there is decomposition, and there is CO2, which is what I was reporting, CO2 back to the atmosphere. Some can be transported all the way to the coastal zones and be kind of accumulated there, or it can be, end up as a sediments in places where the water kind of moves slower or go into a lake. So this is all kind of sources and sinks within that fresh water. Now, let's go to Australia. we don't have the kind of rain that the Amazon or Indonesia has, where it justifies humongous fluxes there in fresh water. But what we have is that our main river systems, and just think for a second about the Mary-Darling River, all around, it's heavily agricultural, which basically means that we have opened up all that vegetation cover that protects the soil. We expose sometimes the bare soil for some time, in between crops to rains, and that's what really bring all that soil, litter, and organic matter, particulate matter, dissolved matter into the rivers, which then you do have the usual processes of sedimentation, decomposition, and that decomposition is what we have measured. Now, the way we did it is this massive global data sets, which they collect any data that has been ever reported in any country, rivers, and then it gets all put together in a data set, and then this data set fit into a model. So these things, we don't have enough data continentally to understand exactly what the fluxes are, but through a larger effort where all the data brings and feeds into a global model, we can then zoom into the expectation of what's happening in Australia. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Pep. We might move on to the next question. Unless, Dan, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not
no
on that
explanation.
one.
No. All right, we'll move to the next one then. So the next one's from Kenneth, and it's asking about the Australian projections for LULUCF, which is land use change, and forestry as a net sink. So I think he's asking about that it's the potential for the positive feedback, but questioning about how this risk is managed. So I don't know, Dan or Pep, who would prefer to take that one, but
Dan can start and I'll follow up.
Dan to start. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure exactly which risk we're talking about.
Fires first.
So at the moment, the government carbon accounting for LULUCF is done using a model called the Full Carbon Accounting Model, or FullCAM, and that's based on measurements of tree biomass, tree growth, taken in the present and the past. We're using decades of data, including a lot that's been collected around Australia in very recent years. What we don't have is data on tree growth going into the future, and we also don't have data on how much of the tree growth we're measuring now is different to what it would have been if CO2 levels hadn't been changing. So it's quite hard to untangle those effects of CO2 fertilization, for example, from what we're observing when we go out and measure a 20 or 50 or 100-year-old tree right now, and to know where is the CO2 fertilization effect. Is that that's the start of an answer? You might be able to add something to that, Pep.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I'll focus more on the actual potential disturbances going into the future, which is complementary to what you just said. So, I think that, the big fundamental premise, should be that a ton of carbon buried into coal 200 meters underground, it's not equivalent for all purposes of the climate system to a ton of carbon sitting in between some branches, some stems, some leaves, and a bit of soil. So I think that as we move forward and we look at, trying to enhance the carbon stock of the landscapes of Australia, one thing we need to understand is that we cannot do just purely one-to-one relationship, that we have to allow for, a buffer, because we know that there are disturbances that have always existed, and you can say long-term everything balance out. What long-term doesn't balance out is when you change the fire regimes or any disturbances regimes, including drought, of course, for certain regions. And so I think that we basically need to develop frameworks where we don't necessarily equate one-to-one, a fossil fuel emission to a land-based emission. And I think that some of these programs, they do have buffers. So I think that hopefully that answers also, what you had in mind with that question.
Thanks, Dan and Pep, for that comprehensive answer. I think, Dan, were you typing to answer the climate scenarios question, or
I
did you want to
was,
just
but I
verbally
realised,
say
I'll
it?
just give the quick answer
Yeah,
now, which is,
yeah.
thanks, Will, good question. I will have to take it on notice. So those models were run in about 2014, and at that point it was a middle of the road of the range of climate scenarios, and I think it was done for 2085 and one period that was closer to the present. But I'd have to go back and check the methods to tell you which scenario was used. Happy to email you that.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I think the next question is also for you from Paul Madiazzi. So thank you for the question. How do we reconcile some modelled results showing very large carbon sinks from LULUCF in contrast to CSIRO's assessment of realisable abatement of about 100 million tonnes?
So this comes back to the question. I think that so the numbers that CSIRO used in that assessment of sequestration potential, the authors there, I think, were using numbers that were equivalent to the way that Australia, the government, reports greenhouse gas emissions and sinks based on anthropogenic changes to, well, anthropogenic emissions, anthropogenic changes to land management. And what PEP's showing is much larger fluxes going in and out of the whole living environment, whereas what I think those numbers relate to is specific sinks that can be attributed to choices about land management, such as, for example, directly putting in, planting trees or other forms of changes to vegetation and soil, but doesn't take account, for example, of those fluxes that might happen from year to year with wet and dry years and things like that. And this is a fascinating question, which Pep and I and others have discussed a lot about how to reconcile these figures. So Pep may have something to add on that.
Yeah, thank you. Just very quickly to say that, first of all, the data we present, or that I presented for the budget, it's data for 1 decade. I mean, this is very heavily duty amount of data that needs to be put together to develop one of these budgets. And the truth of the matter is that then I go in the last slide and I show that the whole net carbon balance goes from a source to a sinks from 1 year to another, which clearly shows that detecting long-term trends, it is a real challenge in this country because these, highly variable dynamics, and that we would need to actually put multiple of those budgets going back in time for which we do not have data, particularly if we're looking at some of the satellite data that I was just showing. Of course, we don't have these data. Satellites were not there before. So it kind of makes it a little bit of a challenge. The other one is to really redefine, continue the refining that, what we call the natural CO2 sink. It's a model natural CO2 sink, and we're not pretending that we know it very well. We provide very specific large uncertainties to show that so much more work needs to be done. But I think that there's a huge landscape which we know is changing. National Greenhouse Inventory is not touching every single hectare of the entire continent. There's been decisions made about leaving some of the grasslands or some of the rangelands outside. And I think it's important to understand that everything is changing a little, and that this high variability, it doesn't make it easy for us to pick up the trends, but plenty of work to be able to do a better job.
Thank you. So I think we've got time for one more very quick question, and I think there's one about measurement techniques, or there's one about the sign of change.
I'd be happy to take the question from Yingping Wang.
Yep.
And the question of how reliable is the estimated emission uptake estimate for that period. So what the methods that are used for that reporting are doing is not measuring the atmosphere, for example, which is one of the inputs into PEP's models. What it's measuring is the environment, looking at the gain or loss of trees. The most significant input into that model, year by year, is satellite data on the change in woody cover across Australia. So areas that have ceased to be forest or started to be forest provides a very major input to say, well, if this area that was forest is no longer, how much biomass is likely to occur there? What would that mean in terms of changes to carbon? And then, of course, there's also inputs on fires and a lot of the processes that go on within forests, and also changes to other land uses. So, and there's a lot of testing and a lot of calibration done on different components of it. So definitely say best available. It's quite a sophisticated model, and it's taking the right things into account. But we don't have some perfect bird's eye view to then say, well, exactly to what degree did we get it right? Or at least we didn't for that period. Moving into the future, perhaps with some of the direct atmosphere sensing satellites that Pep referred to in his talk, this might become increasingly possible to have an alternative source of validation at that broad scale.
Great. All right, thank you. Apologies we didn't get to all the questions. We might, perhaps we might be able to answer quickly in the chat while we're finishing off, if possible. Otherwise, we'll get in touch with those people separately to answer their questions. I'd like to thank everyone, especially Pep and Dan, for the excellent presentations today, for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us. We're very grateful, and thank you to everyone in the audience for your great questions and for attending today. Please go to our website to sign up for our newsletter, where you can find more information about future webinars and Hub News. You'll also be able to find the recording of this presentation on there, so you can have a look again for future reference and share with your colleagues. And I hope you all have a really lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much, everyone.